Great. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is 1 p.m. in Liverpool, where I am, and 1 p.m. also in London, where Keston and Simone are. It's 4 p.m. in Kampala, Uganda, where Hazel is, and it's 9 p.m. in Manila, Philippines, where Mitzi is. My name is Abhi Devanayagam, and I'm training to be a public health specialist. I undertake research on health systems, climate, and racism, and I am a member of the Race and Health Collective. And I'll be your facilitator today, and I will try to make explicit links to health wherever I can. I'll start by telling you a little bit about Race and Health. So Race and Health are a collective of academics, healthcare professionals, activists, and most importantly, individuals from within and outside of the medical and public health fields who want to highlight and tackle the impact of racism on health. Discrimination comes in many different forms, and the forms that we focus on at Race and Health are skin color, religion, caste, indigenous status, and migratory status. We initially actually began as a purely academic group that were writing the first Lancet series on racism, xenophobia, discrimination, and health, but quickly realized we need more than academia to make meaningful social change. We were in international press within a week of launching, and we had 350 responses to our global consultation. And these responses have been reviewed and analyzed and incorporated into our organizational strategy. And the most requested output was webinars, which is what we are here for today. And the theme of this webinar is Envisioning Environmental Equity. Climate justice is racial justice. There are so many ways in which the climate crisis affects our physical and mental health across the life course. And often when we hear about the climate crisis, we think about it as happening in the future, but it is already happening. The epidemiology of diseases such as malaria and dengue are already changing with rising temperatures and increasing disease transmission, with countries such as Sri Lanka, which is where I'm from, bearing a greater burden. Small island relocations are already happening as we speak. Fires and droughts reduce crop yields, increase food insecurity, and lead to malnutrition and starvation. But whilst the climate crisis affects all of us, it doesn't affect all of us equally. And this is what we're here to discuss today. We believe that climate and health justice can't be separated from racial justice, and we're very keen for the public health, mainstream public health field to adopt this narrative. And we have an excellent panel here with us today to do exactly that. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you're new to anti-racism work, new to public health, or new to climate justice, and any of the terms we use don't make sense, please let us know. I apologize in advance for any of the jargon that we use. If you're on Zoom, you can shout out in the Q&A or the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, please tweet us at Race and Health, and we have members of the team going through the questions on Zoom and Twitter. In our first webinar, we received over 70 questions, and if we have a similar number, we won't be able to get through them all, but we will try to address as many as possible. So without further ado, I would love for the speakers to introduce themselves. I welcome you to say a bit about yourself and how you envision environmental equity in your field of practice. So let's start with Mitzi.
Hi everyone. So I apologize if you can hear my neighbors' TVs. They like the black out really loud. So I'm a climate justice activist based in Manila, Philippines. I organize with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, an alliance of organizations, organizations, individuals, and student councils that advocate for immediate youth-led global climate action, collective action, defense for environmental defenders, and system change. So in the Philippines, we are the local chapter of Fridays for Future International Movement. If you are familiar with it, it's basically the youth strike, global strike movement of the youth for the climate. And a lot of what we do in YACAP and what I do is making sure that voices of people from the global south are heard and amplified and that is how I see environmental equity in my field of practice, where we see media showing the youth climate movement not as these white European-led movements, but really as how it actually is, a global youth movement across the world, a movement that has people from everywhere.
So sorry to interrupt you, Mitzi. We can't hear you very clearly. I was wondering if, I don't think it's interference from others. I think it might just be your sound. I was wondering if we can try again.
I will transfer and let the other speakers introduce themselves first.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mitzi. We want to hear everything that you say clearly, so that would be great. Shall we go to Keston whilst we wait for Mitzi?
Sure. My name is Keston Perry. I am a lecturer in economics and a political economist at the University of the West of England, based in Bristol in Southwest England. You might have, probably some of you all might have heard, Bristol was on the map last summer during the uprisings that happened globally for Black Lives Matter after the death of George Floyd, where the statue of a former enslaver was more or less toppled and thrown into the sea. And I think that is perhaps a good starting point for us to think about what climate equity and climate justice might mean in terms of overturning certain kinds of colonial and colonial ideologies, but the long histories and legacies of colonialism that have an impact on us today, which also impact the climate crisis in myriad ways. So when we think about colonialism and its impact, we need to think about the fact that countries that are most impacted are those that have been former colonies of European countries and European states and powers at one point in time. Some of them are many in the region of the Caribbean, including Cayman Islands, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, there's still a form of colonial relationship that happens even now with Great Britain. So we have to think about the fact that economic production processes and economic systems were set up in the image and likeness of colonial extraction and exploitation, which resulted in the kinds of environmental degradation, decimation of indigenous peoples, and also the impact of plantation slavery on those societies, which it's not coincidence that those societies are also some of the most vulnerable and some of the most exposed to the climate crisis as a result. Climate justice for me would mean some form of reparatory justice and restitution and some form of reparations in direct line related to the history and legacy of colonialism and its impact today regarding the climate crisis. It has to come in the form of a program of reparations and a program that seeks to correct and recognize the injustices that have been laid at the communities and societies that have been least responsible for the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Keston. And we're really looking forward to exploring how to practically achieve that and how the health field can help to contribute to that as well. So thank you for that. We'll move back to Mitzi and see how your sound is doing now.
Hey everyone, is this better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay.
So what does envisioning environmental equity mean to you, Mitzi?
So we all know that when you think of Fridays for Future and you think of the youth climate movement, what you'll see in media especially is white Europeans, and they do amazing work, that's true, but environmental equity would mean centering the voices and the narratives and the stories of people directly impacted by the climate crisis today. So much is talked about fighting for the future and being afraid of the future, but the thing is the climate crisis is already here and we're fighting for our present as well. And that is something that needs to be talked about. That is something that needs to be brought forward, because how are we supposed to pressure world leaders to act urgently when they don't see and experience, and they don't hear the stories of people who are already experiencing the dangers of climate crisis today. And that is what environmental equity to me is, making sure that our voices, our stories, our narratives are brought to the front line, and we are seen as the leaders that we are, and not as sad stories and statistics and anecdotes and speeches. We are people who have been fighting for so long, and we have a voice. We're not voiceless. We just haven't been listened to.
Thank you, Mitzi. That's so powerful when you talk about it. Often when we hear about giving a voice to the voiceless, that's such an interesting way of putting it. We have been speaking, but just no one's been listening. Thank you. We'll move on to Hazel.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hazel Najinda, and I'm from Uganda, Kampala. So I am the founder of Climate Operation, and basically what we do is that we educate children about climate change and its intersectionality. And after going through those education sessions, we then always do tree planting activities, because we believe that it's not just about giving someone information on climate change. If you involve them in activities that connect them with nature, this will encourage them to further ask themselves questions of how they can actually protect the environment. So to me, how do I envision environmental equity? Well, since Climate Operation is solely based on educating young people about climate change, its intersectionality, and in Uganda, most children do not have access to books, and most schools don't even have access to the internet. So meaning most of the climate change information and education is on the internet, so they actually don't have access to it. Then also of late, most of the information about climate change is very scientific, so it's not that digestible to children. So to me, environmental equity is creating a space where people from poorer countries, or basically people from disadvantaged backgrounds, have the opportunity to educate themselves on climate change and to get involved without, for example, having to spend money to actually just get to know about something as the climate crisis. As Mitzi has said, it's actually impacting us right now. So to me, that is how I envision environmental equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. That's a really interesting point about communicating the importance of it and communicating it to children. And that's something in academia we're not very good at doing. As Race and Health, we started off as mainly an academic output, but we need activists and we need people like you to help us communicate to the general public, to disadvantaged communities. Thank you. And finally, Simone.
Just realized I was on mute. Hi everyone, I'm Simone, my pronouns are she, her. Like for me, like environmental equity would actually, it gets us to question like rethinking society as we know it. Like our current society runs on like exploitation, extraction and control. And I think like without Britain and other like global North nations who profited from the wealth accumulated from colonialism and slavery and taking responsibility for their past and current profiting off the climate breakdown, we're not going to move towards solutions that are anti-racist and center those that are most affected by climate change right now, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, particularly in the global South. And I think like from a campaigns perspective, which is like the area that I work in, this looks like power being put back into the communities that are leading the way on producing the climate solutions and are doing the most to resist it. And like more often than not, that is Black, Indigenous people of color in the global South. And like putting the power back in them rather than in the hands of private corporations and complicit governments. And I think for me as well, like it's about questioning the who and the how of everything and like how do we achieve these things? Like, for example, in your local area, that's thinking about how you can, thinking about the issues that are happening in your local area and thinking about how you can amplify their campaigns or like see how there are links between yours and theirs. And like on a global scale, that is about like redistributing like power and wealth and like thinking about social inequity on like a larger scale and thinking about who's in the poor housing, who's in the low-lying lands without adequate flooding infrastructure, what communities are like in the closest proximity to like extraction or pollution sites. And quite often the answer is the same of like Black, Indigenous people of color in the global South. And I think for me, like finally, like climate justice requires the status quo to be completely transformed for everyone, not just those in positions of power. As we move to like a low.
Sorry, Simone, I think we missed the last sentence that you said.
Oh, no worries. For me, like climate justice requires like a sort of status quo to be transformed, and not just for those in power for at the time that they want to change, but rather at the time of the people as we try to move towards like a low carbon, greener and more sustainable, equitable world.
Thank you. I'm really glad you repeated that sentence. And I asked you to repeat that. Excellent. That was a really good introduction in terms of how what your vision is, and how we all envision this. But it would be good to break some examples down of the legacy, the colonial origins and the legacy, and what the effects of those origins are in the present day in terms of health impacts especially. So perhaps I'll go to Keston first.
If I can share my screen, oh, am I allowed to? Okay, so perhaps I can talk it through. I think I was going to show you a graphic which shows you of the top 10 countries that are affected by extreme weather events. 9 of them are located in the Caribbean region globally. And what this means is that the countries, if we take all of them together, they're responsible for about 0.016% of global carbon emissions. And so the challenge for us is to think about how, in the current moment, these impacts really affect all of society. In these regions where, in this particular region, we can think about the Caribbean and the Pacific. And in these regions, when there is a major storm, hurricane, typhoon, major drought, major climatic event or environmental event, the entire society is affected, which means public health is also affected in terms of hospitals, the ability for communities to receive the healthcare that they need, for the increased expenditures in these kinds of sectors as well are also impacted, to address issues around disease and waterborne diseases. We can think of the impact of in a country like Haiti, for instance, or for instance in the Bahamas, that was affected first by Hurricane Dorian in 2019, and that cost about $3.4 billion, and in addition to $1.1 billion in debt that the Bahamas has accumulated as a result of one single event. When we think about that, and on top of that, after 2019, the Bahamas have been affected by the coronavirus and COVID-19. So on top of trying to address the kinds of economic and social impacts of one hurricane, one major storm, it now has to address and turn to international financial institutions for support to try to redirect funds from sort of austerity and measures to try to address its economic situation, to address major impacts of health, which it's prevented from doing because of rules in the international financial system. So the Bahamas and other countries like it cannot redirect funds to healthcare because it has to service debts by international financial institutions and multilateral and private investors and so on. So you can see these impacts when a hurricane or a storm or a major environmental event hits these countries, the entire system, social, healthcare system, and economic system are impacted all at once, as opposed to a country like the United States or Britain. When there's a storm or when there's an event, the federal government can just pump money into addressing the situation. When these smaller islands are affected, it's really all of the society is affected.
Thank you, Keston. That's just really shocking to see that it's not something of the past. There are these remnants and legacies of colonialism that are completely hindering climate resilience of countries that are previously colonized. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was really clear. Thank you. And I'll move on to Mitzi now. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your work and this term that we hear, most affected people in areas. It would be great if you can define that and tell us about your experience in the Philippines.
So around last September, the Fridays for Future movement were talking and looking for different terms aside from the Global South because of how a lot of people didn't like how it was phrased. Like, so often the Global South, when translating into different languages, has a derogatory connotation to it. Sometimes it's especially developing countries. So aside from the Global South term, there's also the word developing countries, and they're often portrayed as poor and underdeveloped, but really we are so rich in resources, and the reason why we are suffering is because of the global north imperialist countries who are stealing our resources from our land. And so this term coined by the global north to call us poor was something that we didn't enjoy. It didn't sit right with us, and so we started talking to other people. We actually talked to someone from Extinction Rebellion, and that's where we got the term. And the term most affected peoples and areas, although a bit more vague, also encompasses a lot more. So it's not just most affected areas, it's not just the global south, but it's also people who are most affected. So there's that nuance and that caveat that even in countries like, let's say, the Philippines, there are people who are more affected than I am, because I do have the privilege of, no, okay, my friend has the pass. Sorry. So because I do have the privilege of having education, having access to internet, having access to laptops and technology, and people who are more, there are people who are our environmental defenders, our fishing communities, our farmers, our indigenous peoples who have experienced the climate crisis firsthand so much more and have this unique, amazing experience and knowledge that we will never really understand. And these are the people who are most affected. So in each country, also in the global north, there are people who are more affected than others. These are our Black and Indigenous and people of color in the global north. So that's what MAPA means. It's not just a regional and geographical thing, but it's also including gender inequality, racial inequality, sex, gender inequality, and class inequality. And that's why we really like this term. Although in Fridays for Future right now, we are still just using it as like beside global south, because we know it's difficult to like switch terms, and we still want to make sure that we're understandable and that it's clear to us. And a lot of what we talk about now is making sure that our voices are heard, our voices are amplified, and our voices are given space. And it's cool now because for such a long time we were having a difficulty because there was such a divide between within the movement between global north activists and MAPA activists, or LAPA, least affected peoples and areas. So LAPA and MAPA, it's a word mouthful. Okay, I'll just say global north and MAPA. Okay, so there was a divide before with global north and MAPA activists, because even though we had our own space and people were starting to feel empowered, and there was still so little opportunities to work together. And then recently we had this global campaign. It's against Standard Chartered Bank, which is a UK bank, but most of its market is in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and it's funding coal projects in the MAPA areas. And so a lot of people realized that, hey, we have to work together on this campaign because it is a global north bank funding the destruction in the global south countries. And so we started to work together, and it's really an amazing thing once you see the youth coming together, because it's not just becoming a more powerful campaign, but you also see how global north activists really become more intersectional when you actually have someone to talk to. And that's why these webinars are so important, because actually being able to hear someone's stories firsthand, that is so powerful. That's how you get people moving. Like, even if we're on media and you see our interviews, it's not the same as hearing someone's voice of how they've been impacted by the climate crisis. And the Philippines is so impacted by the climate crisis. Like last year, we were hit by the strongest typhoon on the planet. And barely a week after that, the strongest, a month's worth of rain was poured in under 24 hours. And we experienced over an average of 20 typhoons a year, and it's getting worse and worse, and people are suffering. And the important thing here is we're not just suffering and we're not just victims, but we're fighting back and demanding justice.
Thank you, Mitzi. You discussed quite a few things there in terms of language and justice and the importance of voices and what youth are doing. So thank you very much. I wanted to go over to Simone to explore a little bit more about Britain's historic responsibility and how that impacts health as well, because I'm sure many of our listeners are based in the UK.
Yeah, for sure. So like Britain, first of all, has massive ties to like colonialism, very much the head honcho, and a big criminal here. And like Britain bears like the largest responsibility per capita for historic greenhouse emissions than like any other country. And that's compared to like the USA, Canada, Germany, and Russia, which are quite large land masses compared to Britain. And like, it's important to note that Britain like particularly benefited from the slave trade and slave labor and like used this money to actually develop itself. So Britain had one of the first like industrial revolutions, and like historical accounts sort of speak about how there were like loads of like black fog and like people were suffering from like early death or like lung issues or like emphysema. And it's really interesting to see how now we've sort of moved away from that and exported that pollution elsewhere. So we've made places like places in Asia like the capital for like manufacturing and the capital for like sorting out our waste here in the UK, which causes a lot of pollution. So we can see how like we haven't actually gotten rid of our problem, we've rather exported it to like previous colonies. And like it's like also important to see that like Britain also became the financial capital of the world because of its mass accumulation of wealth from the slave trade. And like it was helped to establish banks like Barclays, and like Barclays continues to invest like millions in fossil fuel extraction projects across the world. Some of them are the Cerrejón mine in Colombia, and there's also the Trans Mountain pipeline. And like it sort of reinforces the same patterns of like racism and dispossession and extraction as before. And like it also gives the scope to environmental racism today. And like the important thing to remember about the history of Britain's colonialism and also like effects on climate change is that a lot of these atrocities were legal and like therefore legitimized. They were justified by institutions, by policies, by law. There's a law that was passed in like the 17th century called Terra Nullius, and it basically says that the land belongs to no one, which is completely not true. And they would use that law to justify going to other lands such as like North America and dispossess the people, particularly indigenous people there, because they were like, you're not using this land for profit, but we are, so we're going to clear you off. So it's important to think about like who and what is legitimizing this practice and legitimizing social and environmental injustice. And quite often that is things like our government, our military policies and laws. And like, I think this becomes a global health issue because like with the rise in pollution, people are closer and nearer to like harmful chemicals. We're seeing a rise in like countries who didn't have to deal with certain problems, having to sort of build the infrastructure to deal with them in very real time. And like higher temperatures, for example, we're seeing mosquitoes in areas as high as southern Italy. We're seeing mosquitoes in like northern mountainous areas of sub-Saharan Africa that like hadn't sort of seen that before. So we're seeing higher cases of malaria, which, you know, some regions and countries didn't actually have to deal with before. We're seeing like more hurricanes, which means that people there's not like the capacity to rebuild so quickly when the hurricanes are happening so quickly. There's also like issues with like pesticides and herbicides causing like liver problems and cancer. And like along with that, climate change is leading to like more extended droughts and like water scarcity, which also heightens famines. And like we can see here now that the connections between health and our planet and the health of us and our society are so closely tied. Like we can't tackle health as an issue without looking at climate racism and social injustice. And like, we see here that like placing profits over people, which is the way that our world is currently running, is quite literally killing us.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you so much for, well, the three of you together for outlining the health impacts of climate change and touching on environmental racism, and also, you know, challenging whether meaningful progress and actually repair is possible in the current capitalist society that we live in. Thank you. I'll just want to move to Hazel. When we talked about environmental racism, Hazel, you shared something really interesting about racism not being something that you personally have experienced, or it's not as acutely experienced in a Black majority country. So I wanted to ask you to share your experience of other forms of injustice that aren't racism that you mentioned before to me.
Okay, thank you so much. So as I was saying before the webinar started, coming from Uganda, we are a majority Black country, so an aspect of environmental racism is not something that is largely faced here, but then we have a lot of classism, elitism, tribalism, and when we look at, for example, health equity in interlinking with environmental justice, this is when you see the poorer and like less to-do people are the ones who are facing the biggest impacts of climate change. So basically, the people in the slums, it's the slums whereby they are the most polluted. The industries are located in residential areas where still there are slums there. So that is how you see that instead of it being environmental racism, it comes to how much money do you have? And then this brings in the question of what is this person going to do, because they cannot actually afford proper healthcare. So when they go to the hospital, because they cannot afford proper healthcare, arising from a disease that has been caused because of, let's say, pollution, then they cannot actually be treated. So this is something that's largely happening in Uganda in regards to environmental justice and health. And that is something that we really need to look at, like governments need, and maybe organizations as well, they need to set up policies that actually, can I say, compensate these people that have not really contributed a lot to the diseases that they are facing because of pollution. So that is something that I feel needs to be done. Then also when it comes to the education system as well, environmental justice and health really need to be merged together. And we really need to start educating our children, university students, about not just climate change, but about the health impacts that come with climate change. Because I feel like if people knew about the health impacts, not just greenhouse gas emissions, because I feel like that's something that the media is really pumping out, greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not really looking at the human impact of climate change. So if we are actually educated about the health impact that come with climate change, then people's habits are actually going to change. Because, like, for example, again, here in Uganda, people really buy a lot of plastic bottles. But when we have been going to schools and telling them that instead of actually having a plastic bottle, you can start reusing, you can carry a reusable bottle, because plastic not only harms the environment, but in turn it's going to harm people's health. So educating people about the health impacts arising from climate change can shift their perspective on how to actually behave, which I believe is a very good thing.
Thank you, Hazel. That was just a wonderful definition of environmental racism and the other forms of injustice that are interconnected. Keston, you wanted to come in here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. And that is quite insightful, Hazel. I wanted to sort of put something into perspective a bit with respect to racism. And I also lived for most of my life in a majority Black and brown country. But I think the issue around racism is a global one. And it's one that is born from the experience of colonialism and imperialism. And so when we talk about it when we think about it in that way, it has roots, and it has a space in all of our societies, regardless of whether phenotypically our society is Black or brown. right? Because it is as a result of the process of colonization that we have racism. And the fact that when we think about the kinds of either transnational corporations that might be involved in polluting activities or extraction of minerals and so on, many of these kinds of activities are born and are continue from that process of colonialism. So it is directly linked regardless of whether the people around us are brown or black, or the fact that we live in perhaps in one physical geography that is majority white. So racism is everywhere is basically the point I wanted to make.
Thanks, Kirsten. Thank you for that. We have so many questions coming in, and I just want to maybe move this over to some action-orientated discussion. So some of the questions we've come in, so the first one we'll start with is, how do we decolonize environmental spaces? Shall we start with Simone?
Yeah, happy to. I think like decolonizing environmental spaces, first of all, like takes the sort of acknowledgement that like our world needs to change and that we're not the actual leaders. Well, I'm gonna say I mean like those of us like in the UK, like global north, we're not actually the leaders on climate change. Like it needs to start with that. There's a lot of climate conversation that like sort of places the blame on like people in like, for example, China or India or other countries that are going through their like industrial development at the moment. And like, it's completely untrue that these are the people that are like the main instigators of climate change and climate breakdown. Like given Britain's historic responsibility, for example, of like greenhouse gas emissions and just pollution, extraction, exploitation, that is far from the truth. I think it also requires us to, one, decenter ourselves as the people that are leading it, but two, to also understand that some of the solutions are being made and lived by people already. There are a lot of Indigenous people and communities across the world that like have worked with the land and like worked with their communities for millennia to like make sure that they're not polluting or like extracting in unsustainable ways. And like we can learn so much from the ways that they organize themselves in their lives on how to tackle climate change. It also, I guess, like in that requires us to step away and work towards like abolishing capitalism. Like I think capitalism is like, it runs on inequality, and like racism, for example, enshrines that inequality. And like it's about us as well tackling the solutions that a lot of the climate solutions, because of that, are formed and they don't actually think about the people that are most affected by climate change. So I think it's about like thinking about who gets to survive and who doesn't. And if those answers constantly ring back to people not being able to survive or not people being disposable, then we need to continue challenging like those climate narratives. I also think like to decolonize the climate movement, it's about like learning and listening. Like I think there are quite a few like resources being produced by people that are like resisting climate change that we can read about. Like for example, the Open Democracy releases a lot of these articles. You can also like go on YouTube, watch panels and just sort of understand what's going on there and how we can like support movements across the globe. I also think it's about where you can connecting the history of like colonialism and climate change. Like those two can't be separated, and like it feeds into everything we do in the ways that we operate now in society. So it's about like, and I think colonialism as well does a job to like separate our struggles and like separate the fact that under these systems we're all sort of oppressed by. So it's about connecting our struggles as well. Like why are people, for example, migrating to places and they're facing racist borders? Why are people like losing their lands? Why are people, due to climate change and due to like, you know, extraction from private companies, why are some people facing the brunt of climate change now and why are some not? And like once you start seeing the connections between like like private companies and governments just wanting to secure wealth for themselves at the expense of everyone on the planet and the planet itself. That's when we'll start to bridge all of this. That was really long-winded, but yeah.
Thank you, Simone. Did anyone else want to come in on this? And there's also other questions, there's similar questions about which are action orientated, but mainly how to put pressure on governments and corporations to take action against environmental and racial and health injustice. So Mitzi, do you want to touch on decolonizing spaces and then also how specifically we put pressure on governments?
So I will be answering them separately. For decolonizing spaces, I feel like it's such a difficult task because honestly, racism isn't something that I grew up with because the Philippines is like mostly brown, like we don't have that here. But when I was moving into the international climate movement, that's when I noticed it. And sometimes you won't even notice it. Like you yourself, you'll realize like 2 or 3 days after, and you'll be like, oh shit, that was racist. Like, and then you'll start like overthinking everything, and you'll start. It was such a slow learning process for me who was already experiencing it. So how much worse is it for people who are unknowingly racist? And that's something that's super important in remembering how to decolonize spaces, is that we have to learn that we are all privileged in one way or another. And we need to be able to feel safe to call other people out and to be called out ourselves. And we have to remember that when we are doing this, it's not because we're mad at each other, but it's because we want the movement to grow, especially white allies. I have had so many responses where I've called people out and said, in a very nice way, albeit, and I'll be like, hey, this isn't the best way to do this. And then they'll be like, oh no, I'm such a horrible person. And it's like, it's not about you right now. Don't think about you. You don't stop. And there's so much to deal with, and there's so much to break down. And sometimes people will be like, oh, but I'm a nice person. I didn't intend to do that. But that's the thing. You don't intend to be racist. Like people in the movement usually aren't racist on purpose, usually. So you have to know that you have to be able to be willing to be called out, and you have to know that this is going to be a lifelong process of unlearning the systemic injustice and oppression that's been taught to us by society. And so you have to be willing to be called out, and you have to realize that this is something that's going to happen forever. You're never going to fully understand what it is because a white person will never experience this. You will never experience it, so you will always have to keep learning. And when there will be times when people calling you out won't be nice. We will be angry, and we will say hurtful words because we've been dealing with lifetimes of oppression, and it's difficult, and it's a traumatic task sometimes. Since I haven't experienced it my entire life, it's easier for me to talk about it a little because I've only started experiencing it lately. And I also recognize that my experiences and my truth is only mine. And that's something that you also have to remember as a white ally, that do not lump us up all together and like, oh, hey, BIPOC, is this a BIPOC friendly brand? It's like, we all have different experiences. We all have different stories, and you can't just put us all together like that and think that we're one autonomous body. And that's something that you have to remember. You guys aren't expected to speak for the white race. Why are you expecting one person of color to speak for everyone who's not white? And that's something that we have to remember. Like, there's so much to do, and there's so much to look at, and learning starts when you realize that you don't know enough and that you will never know enough. And then you'll be open to learning, and then you'll be open to being called out. And even if it hurts, you'll just suck it up and realize that, hey, there's truth in this. I have to find it.
Thanks, Mitzi. I just wanted to touch on, again, action orientated, but some questions have come in about what different organizations can play and what people can do locally as well. The first one is, what role does NGOs and philanthropic organizations play when it comes to climate justice and the health impacts of climate justice? Hazel, can I come to you on this?
Okay, so in NGOs and philanthropic organizations, so oftentimes these are organizations that are funded by other people, governments. So basically, I would give the perspective of Uganda. We have so many NGOs here that are alleviating poverty, climate change, and their role is to go to communities and kind of educate them on how they can, let's say, how can I say it? So basically they go to communities and then they basically educate them about how they can live better lives. Though in my opinion, I feel like the NGOs are not doing that much when it comes to, for example, environmental justice. And then the NGOs are also communicating, can I say, a single-use kind of environmentalism, whereby they are very white-based. They are not still looking at the human impact. So I believe that the role of NGOs needs to be more intensified, whereby they need to actually start dealing with how to make sure that people who are facing the impacts of climate change are actually being helped, and not always talking about greenhouse gas emissions. I'm not saying that greenhouse gas emissions are not a serious thing, but I feel like the human impact and like the damage to biodiversity is something that we really need to look at. So when it comes to NGOs and philanthropic organizations, they really need to step up and do better, because I believe they are in a position of privilege, because they really they play a very big role when it comes to also influencing the way governments make policies, because they have a say about what the policies that governments make. So that's something that I feel like NGOs need to be doing right now.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in on this? And whose responsibility is it? Is it the responsibility of NGOs? Is it the responsibility of governments? Who's doing what? And who should be doing what?
If I could come in again.
Of course.
So I also believe that it is the government's role to actually make sure that, because you see, like, for example, in Uganda, we have very many industries, and ironically, these industries are actually located in residential areas. The government is not doing enough for one to tax these industries to pay more, because you see, the industries are polluting, which is harming the environments, but nothing is being done. So governments need to make policies that are holding these industries accountable, whereby if this industry is emitting this amount and these pollutions are actually affecting communities, the communities around them, they need to actually be paying for those emissions. They need to be compensating those people, because the people that they're actually harming do not have access to better health care. They do not have access to the expensive medicines that they are going to go to the hospital, because usually due to pollution, people actually are having more respiratory diseases. So you can go to hospital, you clearly don't have money. So you're actually going to go there and you're not going to be able to afford it. And the government is not doing enough to make sure that these companies are not emitting as much. They need to be limiting them and maybe making them pay more depending on what they are emitting, and maybe also encouraging them to start producing more sustainably, because right now companies are changing the way in which they produce, so they are becoming more sustainable in their production.
Thank you, Hazel. You touched on funding there and make them pay more, which is totally Keston's speciality. So I just wanted to touch on that, Keston, if that's okay. So how does you talk about a climate stabilization fund? So how does it actually look like in practical terms? How do you fund climate justice?
It has to come from, I think, from a number of different sources. I think first it has to come in part from the states that have funded the kinds of polluting and extractive activities, often in fossil fuels. Also those countries, European countries, European, North American countries, those countries that have also played a part in colonialism, which we don't talk about. We're talking about many North European countries, Denmark, Sweden. These were countries that had colonies as well. And we don't often talk about them. And, even some of the climate movement has ignored this large part of looking inward at their own countries for the fact that these countries have also played a huge part in some of the challenges we face today with respect to climate change. So it has to come first from those states. Second, it has to come from corporations, multinational corporations, financing corporations like banks. Some of the top 10, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, we've seen billions of dollars spent in fossil fuel extraction and exploitation. From majority of these banks and financing corporations are in the United States, are in Canada, and in Europe. So we need to look at, one, the corporations that are directly involved in the extraction, but also those that are funding the kinds of extractive activities. So, and we also need to look at, we've been hearing some discussion around wealth taxing wealth and certain kinds of activities related to, you know, the absolutely astronomical inequality that we're seeing today as a result of the coronavirus, but even before. So it has to also come from individuals and global capitalist institutions that have also facilitated these kinds of activities. So those are sort of kind of 4 or 5 sources from which we can begin thinking about applying a mechanism to seek recompense from those kinds of institutions and individuals.
Thank you, Kirsten. And then moving on to when dealing with policymakers, because I'm sure we have a lot of activists and health professionals here. How do we, when we deal with policymakers and government officials, how can we protect the interests of these vulnerable communities and minoritized people? Simone, I'll come to you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I was just answering a little Q&A as well.
Not at all. Thank you for multitasking. How, when we deal with policymakers, do we ensure that the needs of vulnerable people who are facing the worst health impacts of climate change are represented?
You know, interestingly enough, that was the question I was answering just now in the chat. I think like it's really important to work with the communities that are affected by climate change the most. Like they're the ones that are facing the brunt of the pollution. They're the ones that have the demands for what level they'd like the policy to reflect. So for example, like with the sorry, the name is gone. Sorry, Ella Roberta case here in the UK. She, for people who don't know, is a young Black girl who unfortunately died, and it was caused by high levels of air pollution. And where she's from, it's like the air pollution there is consistently over the EU limit of, I think it's 0.4 milligrams per meter squared or something like that. And like the people in that area have consistently campaigned for, one, the levels to be below that, but also for it to be lower. And it's like, if they're telling you that, yet you're still creating policies without listening to the people that are most affected by the air pollution levels being at that level, then there will continue to be a disconnect, and we'll continue to create solutions and create policies that don't actually reflect the people that are most affected by it. So I think it's about connecting with community, like people in the community activists, community organizers, finding out what's actually happening in these local areas, and like co-creating policy with them and making sure that their demands are like the center of the policies made. And it is really difficult because I'm someone that I'm not necessarily in the policy field, but I do understand it's very hard to pass like really like radical policy, or policy that really like shakes things up. But I think like it's important here to aim to the highest, because it's like without doing that, we're going to continue to make very small incremental changes, when in fact the consequence of air pollution or the consequence of climate change is so large, we can't afford to be doing that anymore. So I think, yeah, to round off, it's working with people in that community, also sort of like getting the expertise from them. Like I don't think, like, we can't know everything, particularly people who don't live in those areas. So it is about having that connection and making sure that it's productive. Like, I think sometimes governments or policymakers can like create the space for these people to give their knowledge and expertise, but quite often it feels very extractive because they don't do anything about it, or they don't actually reflect their demands in there. And like there isn't even any compensation for their time and their effort. So I think as well, like going into these communities, you need to understand that like you must be willing to do something, and you must be willing to create a space where people feel comfortable to, you know, share all of this with you.
Thanks, Simone, for so many tangible ways that people can engage with communities and engage with people locally who are most affected by this. I wanted to quickly touch on COVID as well, just in the interest of time. There's been a question which asks, what impact does COVID have on the climate justice movement and climate change? I just want to reword that slightly in terms of how do we build the reset from COVID with climate change and a climate change lens? Keston, do you want to take that since you have to leave first?
Oh my, you
give don't.
Tough question, because I have some serious qualms, and if anyone follows me on social media, they would know, or you know, things I've written, they would know that I have some serious issues around these discussions we've been hearing about green recoveries, and the sources from which they're coming. They're all often coming from institutions that themselves have been complicit in climate devastation, like the World Bank, IMF. We also been hearing about discussions around a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal. I don't know if I have a policy response, but I think we have to sort of think, I mean, as we probably say back home, we have to think from brass tacks, meaning from the very basic fundamental idea around what are the issues and what are the problems that we're trying to find solutions to, instead of sort of starting from these big grand ideas which themselves can reproduce some of the same inequalities that we're trying to solve. So the idea of a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal starts from the global north. It starts from institutions in the United States and in Europe themselves that have in some way or the other been complicit in some of the challenges we face, and themselves have not reflected or thought about that complicity. So I mean, and also we also have this idea that if we add and this is not in response to what Simone said, which I thought was quite genuine, but if we add one person of color to the committee or to the discussion, or one Indigenous person in the mix of the discussion of these kinds of policy frameworks, that it's going to kind of solve the inherent inequities that we're trying to address. And it's tokenistic to a large degree, but also it's just not reflective on what the challenge that we face and what kind of solutions that we need to come up with. That for me has to start at the community level. It has to start very, very deep in the community. And for me, I'm a bit cynical about policy, but it definitely has to start from a different way, from a different approach from how we are accustomed, and which is not from a sort of state-based kind of approach. I have to run. It was really lovely to be in conversation with all of you and to learn so much from all of your experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining, Keston. We will round off soon because we're coming up to 2 o'clock. We have one question about COP26 coming up in Glasgow later this year. Do Black, Asian, and Indigenous scientists and activists have a seat at the table? Do you feel like your voices are being heard? So I'd come to Mitzi here.
No, I think that's a simple answer. No. If I were to give a more detailed answer, first, it's hard for scientists. I will speak from the Philippines. First, it's hard for Filipino scientists to be there because our scientists here don't have support. And so a lot of times they like, it's not just a COP issue, it's also a local issue that we're not prioritizing climate science. We're not supporting our scientists. Last year, no, not last year, the COVID pandemic has messed up my timeline. Last year, in Madrid, our government did not give an official delegation. So the ones that went there were the NGOs. And NGOs are great, but as Hazel said, that they have a different role in these types of things. And we also need activists there. And if you look at the activists there, maybe there's one Filipino or a few Filipinos or a few Asians, but look at the Europeans that are there. I mean, even just the location of every conference of parties, like almost all of them have been in Europe, like, and just that alone, or at least the last few years have been in Europe. So just that alone already makes it so difficult for people not from these countries that you mentioned, these continents, to be there. And so it's, again, it goes back to how are white men and white women even supposed to create policies about the climate when they don't know how it feels to be afraid of drowning in your own bedroom, when they don't know how the climate crisis looks. It's never stared at them in the face. How will they understand the urgency if there's no one there to tell them about it? And that's why it's so, so important for us to be there, to make sure that we do everything we can, that we have people's voices amplified, and we support people, we support activists from these continents, the most affected areas, because this is our story to tell.
Thank you for that. Thank you to all of you. I just want to finish rounding up with what actions people who have been listening to this webinar can take. So if each one of you could say your one top action that people can take in their local community or their workplace, to really continue to improve health and tackle environmental injustice. Hazel, I'll come to you first.
Great. So I believe that one of the ways in which someone can actually take action is basically just educating themselves about the intersectionality with the environment and health. I believe that education goes a long way to really change someone's perspective on the things that are happening. So educating yourself on the fact that the climate crisis is now. We often, as Mitzi was saying, we're often looking at saving the planet for the future. But what's happening is that it's actually affecting us now. So educating yourself and seeing how best you can actually make a change. It doesn't mean you have to, for example, go for a climate strike, though you can go for a climate strike, but you can also have conversations with your friends, with your family, just having basic dialogue about what's happening and what you guys can do. Then I also think doing volunteer work with your local environmental organizations is also a good way to go, because that gets you in touch with what's really happening in the community. So yes, I think those are some of the actions that the people that are watching can do today.
Thank you, Hazel. Simone.
Yeah, similar to what Hazel was saying, like I think getting involved in your local community, but also thinking about what you're involved in at the moment. I think like there are a lot of areas that people are into, such as like transport or housing justice or energy justice or like divestment, that have very, very strong links to climate justice and like the intersectionality of climate justice, social justice, all of it. So it's like, if you're already in an organizing space, thinking about how that connects to the climate crisis, how that connects to health justice, and exploring the links that way. I'd also say like trying to listen and learn about climate justice from people of color. Like there are so many different like arts and like podcasts and reading groups and movie groups that you can sort of join or watch by yourselves, and like you can make that education fun for yourself. Like you can join a movie group, watch something with friends, have a discussion after. Like some of the best discussions I've had have been after watching films with friends or with organizers and just having like a very casual conversation about that. Some podcasts I'd like really love are like, I wrote in the chat as well, but there's Rise and Resist, there's Mothers of Invention, there's The Hot Take, and there's Breaking Green Ceilings. They're all like really, really informative podcasts that you can sort of listen to in your own time and just sort of hear different people's perspectives and like what solutions we should be thinking about.
Thank you so much, Simone, and thanks for the names of those podcasts as well. Just to add on to that, we've got our new Race and Health podcast as well, and our first episode, which came out 2 weeks ago, is on deforestation, environmental racism and Indigenous health. So please have a listen to that as well. And finally, Mitzi, what's your one action that people who have listened to this webinar can take?
I mean, Hazel and Simone have already said the wonderful answers. I agree. It is about education, and find different ways to educate. So just like Simone said, it doesn't have to be books and boring YouTube, speeches. It can be something fun. It can be something, and do your best to try to find actual people to talk to. Not in that weird, hey, can you talk to me about racism way, but like, be actual friends with people, like really. And when you have a friend when that friend becomes like, feel safe with you, then it will come out naturally. It will come out naturally that you start caring, like the white ally will start caring about you and realizing how blind they were to racism before. I really think that having friendships with people is the way to go, and it's not difficult. Like, we have social media, there's so many things that we can do in order to do it, so it shouldn't be hard.
Thank you to all of you so much. I'll just quickly summarize what's been said and what we've learned so far. We started off by talking about defining environmental racism and how important language is, and communication between activists, artists, academics all together, so that we're all on the same page and we all have the same vision. And then we talked about racism, not only racism in terms of majority and minority, but racism being a global problem when we look at the origins of the climate crisis, but also other issues of injustice, such as social injustice, economic injustice, casteism, tribalism, as Hazel said. And then we also, when it came to action, we talked about looking inwards, where money comes from, outwards, the macroeconomic side of things, where the sources of funding and reparations comes from. And then we talked about how we can actually co-create together what the impact of COVID and climate change has had, and critiquing things like Green New Deal when we're moving forwards beyond COVID. So that's where we've come to. So thank you so much again. And I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to answer all of your questions, and that we've had to change some of the questions to lump some of those ideas together in themes so that we cover as much ground as possible. A little bit about how you can support Race and Health. We're completely unfunded. Please donate to us and support our work. You can sign up to our quarterly newsletter. You can sign up to our podcast. Look out for our academic series. Once again, I would like to thank all of our speakers today for their time. And I also want to thank Chetna, Nita, Nivedita, Ngozi, and Delan for working behind the scenes. And thank you to UCL Institute of Global Health for hosting us in this event. If you have any questions or comments, please email us, contact@raceandhealth.org, and please follow us on social media for any feedback. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you're joining us from.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.